So for the latest episode of Free Kiwis, we're reversing roles, and I'll be interviewing my friend and colleague James Kierstead, who is a senior lecturer in classical studies here at Victoria University of Wellington. And perhaps, we could start with a bit of your background. You were educated at a slightly famous university, weren't you? Did your PhD at some place in England?
Yes, Oxford, actually.
Oh, yes. I think I've heard of it. Yeah.
Yes.
It's got itself into a bit of trouble of late.
Oh, I'm sure it has, in many ways. Lots of universities.
How was it when you were there? Did it sort of live up to the traditions, and did you go to dinner in your academic gowns and all that?
Yes, there was a bit of that. I mean, I think my experience was, bad in the ways that some student experiences can be, in the sense that, I had some stress and worries about various things. But looking back, actually, in terms of the kind of issues around free speech and viewpoint diversity that we're interested in, I think it was kind of a golden age.
Yeah.
And I think that institution was particularly good at that at the time. This was in the early 2000s, partly because it had a certain built-in conservative aspect to it, in the sense there was this old venerable place. They were sort of officially Christian institutions, the colleges of Oxford, even though that didn't really interfere in any way with academic inquiry. So I think, and of course at the same time you had all the left-wing movements that are usually associated with student politics. So I felt like I was exposed to a broad range of things, not only in the political sphere, but also in the religious sphere. And there are also lots of interesting institutions. I remember going to a talk at Campion Hall, the Jesuit college, about Teilhard de Chardin, the mystic and scientist. And I remember you could go to the Oxford Union, which was a debating club, very good at doing debates. It was slightly right-leaning. Some people would say pretty right-leaning. And then there was also the normal, as you might say, student union, and that was more leftist. So I got access to a broad range of views. And I was in a very small college, Corpus Christi, and I think that was good because, there was a common room, and I remember people would read The Guardian, read The Telegraph, and I think people in general got on. We had a kind of direct democratic student structure that we'd have these student meetings and all packed into the junior common room and discuss the various issues of the day, like whether we should remove the Coke machine for being too capitalist and various other things like that. So yeah, it was great.
And you're a bit of a proponent of direct democracy yourself, I believe. Is that right?
Yes, that's right, actually. And I do think of that sometimes, well, partly because I didn't go to all the meetings myself, even though I'm a proponent of direct democracy, which makes you think, actually. But I don't think it's a knockdown argument against these systems to say not everyone will go, because it's more about having the ability to go, the ability to participate.
And you think it could be scaled to the level of governing a nation rather than a student union, or maybe, what they had in ancient Athens, which was a rather smaller place than even New Zealand is in the 21st century?
Well, I think that if you use subsidiarity and different levels, then you can have direct democracy at a local level. And then once you get to the higher levels, you'd have to turn to other methods or modes like
representative type one.
Well, some representation and also referenda. So Switzerland kind of does this. It has direct democracy in some cantons, although I think at the moment only Glarus and Appenzell. I think that's right. But you can have some direct democracy at the local level, and then you can have referenda at the levels higher up. But actually, I was just going to say about the direct democracy at the college level. Even at that level, it raises some interesting problems for direct Democrats, because just on the point of like whether people turn up, there was an interesting episode, I think a few years before my time actually, so I didn't witness it, but I heard about it, which was that the CCCCC, the Corpus Christi College Cricket Club, they all decided that they wanted to go on a tour of Ireland.
Right.
To play all the local teams, right? So they went to the Corpus JCR, which is only a small space anyway, and there's something like a total of under 200 undergraduates in the place. So they basically just packed the assembly And they all went to the assembly, and basically nobody else was there, and they voted. There were probably something like 20 people who turned up to this meeting, this JCR meeting, junior common room meeting. And so they were the majority because there was something like 11 members of the cricket team plus probably some 12th man and hangers on and stuff like that. So they successfully voted themselves a tour of Ireland on college funds.
Very cunning.
So it's an interesting thing because this also happens in ancient history, similar things. So, for example, at one point during Athenian democracy, the democracy is actually undermined and some oligarchs take over. And one of the reasons that this happens is because the fleet, this is in 411 BC, by the way. One of the reasons this happens is because the fleet is off at Samos. It's part of the Peloponnesian
Persians,
War.
was it?
Really fighting the Peloponnesians. It's the war against Sparta and its allies.
Yep.
And so they're off in Samos. And the thing about the fleet is it has a lot of lower class citizens in it. And the slightly wealthier citizens, the kind of men who could afford hoplite panoply we were talking about last time, the weapons and the armor and things like that, they tended to serve as infantrymen. And in fact, what the oligarchs did is they organized an assembly meeting, but outside the city walls, not in the usual place, the Pnyx, which is a hill inside the city walls. And the Spartans actually had a garrison within Athenian territory at the time. So anyway, the whole point of this is just that you can very easily manipulate the kind of things that get put through an assembly by just turning up, thinking ahead and turning up with certain types of people, especially if you know your opponents are going to be away. So these guys who turned up, the slightly better off men, a lot of them oligarchs, they turn up outside the city walls. They know that people who don't have armor aren't going to risk going outside the city walls. They also know a lot of the lower class men are off at sea.
Yep.
They vote the democracy out of existence.
Yeah. Oh,
Just like that. And then, of course, it does get restored very soon afterwards. But still, that's the kind of thing that can happen.
And presumably there are fairly obvious ways around that, such as promulgating agenda of meetings so that people can't take them by surprise if they're not sort of habitually well attended, or having rules about what kinds of issues can be broached when sizable proportions of your population are engaged in military duties and so on.
Yeah, and I think what happened with the Corpus Christi College Cricket Club conundrum or calamity was that afterwards they brought in a quorum.
Right.
I can't remember what the quorum was. It was something like 25. I mean, it was a small college anyway. But in Athens, they seem to have had a quorum of about 6,000 for assembly meetings. I think in the 4th century, definitely in the 4th century, maybe in the 5th century as well. No, I think it was from the 4th century on. We know that for specific decisions, specific types of decisions, they had a quorum of 6,000. And it seems like they actually remodeled the space, the Pnyx where they met, to have a sense of when 6,000 people were in that space.
I see, yes. So we can agree that there are ways of putting in place rules to stop the kind of stacking of meetings and votes that you're talking about. I'm interested, though, in what you think the value base of a population would have to be to support a direct democracy. Do you think it's different than a representative one? So if you're asking people to take much more responsibility for decision making than they do when they vote for a representative who makes various promises and then goes off and does what they want once they become a member of the governing body. In a direct democracy, ordinary citizens are making much more nuanced decisions. And so what does that take, do you think, in terms of the knowledge and values of the citizens who are participating in that kind of system?
Well, I think in some ways people are liable to think that it's more demanding than it is, precisely because of some of these issues that we've already raised. And that is, the fact that you don't have to turn up to every meeting is kind of a problem for the system, because you want it to be truly representative in the sense of sort of statistical representation. You don't want it just to be able to be co-opted by a small cabal. But the fact that you don't have to go to every meeting and turn up to every vote also means that, for example, if I'm not interested in a referendum on whether to ban minarets. Just to think of an example they actually had in Switzerland. Or that's a controversial example, but I mean, anything I'm just not interested in. I'm not interested in architecture.
Yeah.
There's going to be a referendum on whether to have, I don't know,
Change the height limit on buildings.
something like that. I mean, obviously that has other implications rather than just architectural style. But let's take that one as an example. I just don't happen to have an interest in that. Either I'm ignorant or I just feel neutral. And usually you're ignorant because you feel neutral, right? The things that really are important to people, they tend to learn about.
Sure.
And so I think that people can actually get a lot of information on things that they do care about. You know, of course, the flip side of that is the problem we've already talked about, which is that, then there's a bias towards people who are especially interested in the subject. So the problem is always with democracy to try and respect this one person, one vote thing. But I mean, a lot of these problems happen in representative democracies anyway. There might be one election where particular issues are very salient, and certain people don't vote in those elections, and then they have less power as a result with the government that comes into being, right?
Yeah. Yes. Well, I mean, there are systematic effects that we know about, like younger people voting less than older people, or voting in lower proportions than older people, and probably less well-off people being less inclined to vote as well. So there are those issues in representative systems. So to go back to Oxford, you did your PhD there.
No, I didn't actually. I did my PhD in the States.
Okay.
At Stanford in California.
So was it undergraduate in Oxford?
Yeah, I did the undergraduate classics course at Oxford, which was called at the time Literae Humaniores. And I think they've changed that now to classics. I think because it's kind of an obscure thing to say if someone says to you at a party, "What are you studying?" And you say, "Literae Humaniores." But for many years, for many centuries, I guess, several centuries, I guess it was the name of the course, the rather humane letters, the humane letters, I suppose. And this was to distinguish it from other types of letters, for example, sacred ones. So if you go back to the early 19th century and earlier, overwhelmingly Oxford and most higher education institutions were dedicated to religious study, religious education, and they were training.
Yeah.
They were training priests, basically, various types of clergy. And actually, if you look at the history of my college, for example, which is not untypical in this regard, for a long time it's really a sort of intellectual boot camp for anti-Catholicism, or that's the kind of a negative way to look at it, but it's sort of building up a particular type of Anglican Christianity and being involved in translations of the Bible and things like that. But anyway, so then you get this idea that there's also this topic in which you read sort of more humane texts, less explicitly sacred ones. So you get an education in the more secular classics. And that course has a really interesting history because actually at a certain point, it seems like the Brits actually take some inspiration from the Chinese idea of a class of mandarins, the mandarins who were given these furiously difficult exams and the Chinese classics. Yes. So the idea as you go through the 19th century is we want a class of people, or really men at this point, who will know the great classics and also not only is that a good thing in terms of their spiritual and moral formation and intellectual formation, as was believed, but it's also a very good intellectual test. We'll choose the best and the brightest. And at that point, this was in an imperial age. Britain was running an empire, and it was believed that these mandarins who'd done classics would go out and govern the empire. And then what you get in the beginning of the 20th century is reformist movements saying, is it really a good idea that all the people running our societies are educated in Greek and Latin poems and historiography, but mainly actually literature at that point? Maybe we should teach them things like economics and political science. Crazy idea, right? And so what they come up with then is this course PPE, Politics, Philosophy, and Economics, which has really become the civil service exam for mandarins in the UK in the modern age. I mean, right. At least in the Blairite era, when the Labour Party, I guess, was different in terms of who got to the top. than maybe it was in the Corbynite era. A lot of the people from the top of all the main British political parties would have done PPE at Oxford.
Yes.
Philosophy, politics, and economics. And that was actually known when it came in as modern greats. Because another term for literary humaniores was mods and greats, the two parts of the course. And so they thought, there's this thing called greats, which focuses on the ancient world. Let's have a modern greats thing. And the idea was the old style greats gave you an exposure to various different types of things, philosophy, literature, and so on. And the new style greats is also going to be sort of multifaceted, but this time it's going to be those subjects I mentioned, philosophy, politics, and economics. So you're going to get a broad view, but it's going to be of the modern world rather than the ancient world.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't it the case that at least some European universities have a tradition of mathematics and natural sciences going back at least to the 18th century?
Oh no! You're definitely right. I mean, of course, there were, and even in the Renaissance, there were people studying these topics. Yeah. So I don't want to go overboard and say it was all religious education, but I would say it was very strongly weighted in that direction. And of course, it's interesting for the kind of things we're interested in nowadays in terms of viewpoint diversity and freedom of speech, because the people who say, and I've had people say this to me in conversation, it was always the case that there was a slant in institutions of higher learning towards certain viewpoints. That's actually true. I mean, and it's even the case that in the past it was much, much worse, because at Oxford in particular, there were various Anglican items of faith that you literally had to sign up to, or swear to. You had to abide by these items of faith. If you didn't believe in them, if you were an atheist, even if you were a nonconformist, not an Anglican, you could be a Protestant Christian, but of the wrong sort, and you wouldn't be allowed to be at Oxford. Of course, there were ways around. There were people who managed to get by, and especially when you get into the late 19th century, things are a bit more flexible. But officially, that was the way, and so that is much stronger than nowadays. Although, of course, I would say it's great that we don't have that kind of pressure anymore, but we don't need to introduce new types of pressure on what people can say and think.
Well, that's right. I mean, comparing us with an imperfect past is a fairly poor blueprint for the present or future, isn't it? So then you went off to Stanford to do your PhD. And what was your PhD about?
My PhD in the end was about associations in Athens and the relationship they had with the democracy. And by associations, I mean social groups and religious groups and kinship groups. And the ancient world, ancient Greek world, has a lot of these different types of groups, some of which to us seem quite natural, or sort of natural, like religious groups. Some of them seem a bit weirder, like groups based on descent, kinship. And they also have...
groups based on kinship and descent are not alien in New Zealand. I mean, Māori see those groups as being very important.
Yeah, that's right. There's a new book out about this. I can't remember the name of the author now, but he's the guy, Henrik or something like that. He's the guy who did a lot of work on weird people.
Yeah, it's funny you should mention that. I was looking at an article on Corlett just this morning about that. It's the first time I saw that acronym, and indeed they made that point that Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. People are less likely to affiliate with group and more likely to affiliate with things like occupation and vocation.
Yeah, so the question is, to what extent is this a product of modernity, of being the first part of the world that got to the Industrial Revolution? And to what extent is this something that actually is a causal factor in the way that the West became so much more prosperous and free, I guess, in terms of its institutions? But it is interesting because one of the things people talk about when they talk about Athens is to what extent was it sort of precociously modern? To what extent was it sort of on the cusp of modernity? There's some work on this by people like Barry Weingast, who's a celebrated political scientist who took an interest in the classics, and Federica Carragati, an old friend of mine from grad school. And then there are other people who say, no, actually the Greek city-state was this very... maybe atavistic is too strong, but it's a very old-fashioned thing. It's really more about religious belonging and community. And I'm still writing up this dissertation as a book, and I guess I'm trying to have it both ways, because I think in some ways the associations of Athens and the way that the Athenians thought about group and the way that some of these groups are kind of intertwined with their political system. In some ways, they still do they care very much about your descent. I mean, that's the criterion for citizenship. Basically, you have to have both parents born on Athenian soil, and they seem to also have the groups, certain religious groups seem to play a role in defining who gets to be a citizen as well, or at least
to be fair, it's not as if Western culture is that far from those kinds of concerns. I mean, we have them with citizenship still. You get a right to citizenship by birth, and if you want to be American president, you've got to have been born in America, for example. You could argue, couldn't you, that the British class system is based on descent to a large extent. They worry about who your parents and grandparents were, and the class system might be breaking down now, but well into the 20th century, it was very much alive and well. So
yeah,
I'm not sure that you might be able to overstate the extent to which we've transcended concern about descent and kinship.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, I guess a lot of these big history ideas are sort of claims about trends, and it's always easy to think of counterexamples. And I mean, it's not like that's illegitimate. I mean, but it may be the case that even though there are these counterexamples, it's still clear that certain societies are less into this kind of thing than others, right? And that's, I guess, the claim that's being made.
Yeah.
In this new book.
So I guess the question about ancient Athens then might be whether all of those kinship concerns were in decline at the time that democratic ideals were rising, or whether they were maintained just as strongly with an overlay of democracy.
Yeah, so that's kind of what I'm trying to argue now in the chapter I'm writing at the moment. So I have a previous chapter where I talk about how there are these religious groups and kinship groups still around, and people seem to appeal to them when they're under fire for not being a true citizen in court and things like that. So they seem to play some role of a sort that we wouldn't really like to accord to religious and kinship groups. Like nowadays, if you're in the dock for not claiming some privilege that's of New Zealand citizens that you don't deserve because you're not a New Zealand citizen, it'd be really weird nowadays to say, "But I go to this church." Mm-hmm. But they seem to appeal to religious groups quite easily. So there's that. But then the chapter I'm writing now, I think I'm saying that there seems to be, you could argue that there's something of a drift towards what I call rationalization and centralization. So they seem to be moving towards groups that are more purpose-made for certain political purposes. And I think one of the things that's going on is partly this story about social capital, that they like these groups, and these groups do good for the polis, partly because people are just coming together and feasting together and stuff like that. Mm. But I also think in early Greek democracy, or the earlier Greek polis, you can see that they're often using these civic subdivisions, groups of people, in order to disperse authority. So they're saying, there are various tribes, because the Greeks often have these things called tribes, or phuli in Greek, in their city-states. And some of these tribes are associated with great families. And so what we need to do is rotate certain offices around these tribes. So there are various examples of that in early Greek city-states. And then I think as time goes on, they're doing things like using the lot to give people offices, but from the whole citizen body. So it seems like there's a trend towards larger groups of people that they're just allotting. And using the lot, I mean, that's a very rational, sort of statistical way of doing things.
Yes.
And it may be that by the time you get into the 4th century, say, into the later parts of the classical period, the kinds of inequalities, inequities that had been produced by old-style aristocratic families and stuff like that are starting to break down a little bit. They're still around. We can see them in some ways, but maybe those things are less of a worry. And because of that, you don't need to explicitly say, this tribe can only be in office once every 10 years or whatever, or that's not a real example, but you don't need to say something like that. Instead, you can just say, okay, we're all citizens. Let's just choose the next holder of this particular office randomly by lot.
Right, yes. Yeah.
And you can also see, I think, that more sort of organic groups at the beginning. This is a complicated picture too, because a lot of them that look sort of organic are actually partly artificial, but it seems like there are groups which sort of grow up for religious purposes or whatever. And then there are times in Greek history, for example, at the beginning of the Athenian democracy, under Cleisthenes, where he just creates artificial civic subdivisions. He just says, we're going to have the whole of the population divided into 10 tribes. Tribes, right? It's not quite the right word, but we're going to divide the population into 10 groups, and he uses that as a way of, as I say, dispersing authority.
So is it a bit like electorates in our modern democracies?
Well, this is the interesting thing because, nowadays we think very much in this representative frame of mind. And some people have argued that the tribes in Athens have a representative function, but that's an arguable point, but it's clear that that's not their main function. I mean, their main function isn't like a modern constituency.
Right.
So it's not to say like we're going to, well, sometimes it is. So for a long time they have 10 generals in Athens and one is voted from each of the 10 tribes. And there are other offices. There are several offices which are done like that, but the tribes aren't geographically based. They're just random divisions of.
But they're arbitrary. They're not based on kinship or any other recognizable.
They're designedly arbitrary. Presumably, well, one text says that Cleisthenes wanted to mix up the Athenians, and they're designedly arbitrary because there were actually four. You're getting really deep into ancient history now, but there were 4 more traditional tribes in Athens before him, and he didn't get rid of them, but he seems to have been trying to sort of break up the old patterns of allegiance,
right,
and to start things anew. And so the tribes actually have different villages in them, different parts of the Athenian territory, and each one of them has little bits of the Athenian countryside. So there has to be some villages in the coastal area, some villages in the inland area, and some villages in the city area in each tribe. So it's very complicated. And you think, like, why did he go to all this trouble in designing this system? And it's not unique. I mean, other Greek city-states are playing with the same kind of ideas. And the reason seems to be Greek Democrats were obsessed with this idea of political equality. How do we make sure that people from different areas have the same chance of being magistrates and things like that? But anyway, I was saying to you, the tribes weren't representative, and then I thought of all these examples where they actually elect officers from the tribes. But the reason I say that is because in some ways their main purpose was things like there's a council of 500, and each tribe sends 50 men to the council of 500 every year, and these are selected by lot. So there's a sense in which they're representative because they're sending 50 men to the center, but they're not being elected. They're a lot of volunteers.
Interestingly, though, in terms of representation, you get better representation by a random process than you do by a selective one.
Exactly.
That's why in science, in social science, we want to randomly sample people to be in experiments because otherwise you have sample bias.
Yes, and I think that actually democracy in some ways can and should be seen as a political system, the basic idea of democracy is that the people should rule. It doesn't really tell us much more than that. I mean, the basic Greek meaning of it is the rule of the people, if you just look at the words for whatever that's worth. So then the question is, well, how do we do this? How do we do this thing how do we design a political system so that the people are really in control? And so then you want to make claims about the people really being in control. And so in some ways I think you can see democracy as a way of doing statistics in terms of political representation. So you want to make sure you get a good sample of people. You want to make sure you can make the claim that the people are really ruling in this system in a way that they aren't really ruling in an alternative system. And so this is one of the areas where I think we can learn something from the ancient Greeks because, in a lot of ways their system was horrible. It excluded women, they had slaves and so on and so forth. But one thing that we assume nowadays is that elections are very democratic. And this is an assumption they didn't make. In fact, they seem to think, and Aristotle says, elections are a more aristocratic feature of constitutions.
It doesn't seem obvious to me that they're intrinsically democratic. I mean, there are means that we use to implement democracy, and it does seem a flawed means in many ways.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, I think that's right. I agree with that. I mean, I just think that you're a rare individual in the sense that if you look at a lot of the organizations which measure the amount of democracy in the world, they often will look at whether there are free and fair elections. And it's not like I'm against free and fair elections. I think societies which have free and fair elections are more democratic than ones that don't. I mean, that's fairly obvious.
That happens to be the case in the modern scenario. It's not inevitably so. If you did have, for example, countries that chose their governments by random ballot, then you would have an argument about whether that was more democratic than those that had free and fair elections.
Exactly, and I think one of the reasons we don't have that situation where we're comparing countries which have allotment and countries which have elections is that we don't have many countries or any countries that use allotment that much.
No.
And so, I mean, it's scientific level. But yeah, the Greeks just didn't assume this. And in fact, they associated the lot very, very strongly with democracy. It even seems to be the case. I mean, this is one possible explanation of why the Pythagoreans didn't like bean eating.
Didn't like bean eating.
So apparently Pythagoras banned his followers from eating beans.
He was a bit of a strange chap.
He was a bit of a strange chap. It was kind of like a cult.
Yeah.
Believe that numbers were the explanation for the universe,
Well,
the
he might
divine
be right
principle.
about that, but he had some other weird ideas.
What were you thinking of?
Well, the idea that geometrical shapes had mystical connotations.
Yeah, that kind of thing. Yeah. So there's a lot of that. But so people say, well, why did he ban his followers from eating beans? And there are various explanations. One of them is, I think, that beans make you fart, and that shows that there are souls that have been resurrected in the beans, because he also believed in metempsychosis, a form of reincarnation.
So you saw bean eating as a form of cannibalism.
Possibly, but we don't really know. But there is some evidence. There are some texts that pretty much say this, that they don't like beans because the Pythagoreans aren't keen on democracy, and democracy is strongly associated with beans. Why? Because at some points beans were used for allotment procedures. So in any case, yeah, they use the lot a lot. Why are we talking about this? I mean, it's good, but I mean, there was some point I wanted to get back to.
Well, we were talking about the difference between, well, whether elections are as democratic as a random. What is the best process, I suppose, for representing the people, for giving rule to the people?
Yeah.
And it seems to me you have to first of all decide what you mean by the people, because I would imagine that even in ancient Athens, they were a lot more collectivist in their view of themselves than modern Westerners are, for example, who are quite highly individualistic. I mean, I know they had elements of individualism in the way they competed in games and perhaps, for glory in battle and this kind of thing. But they would have been, I imagine, a more collectivist society than we are. And so that gives you a different view of what the people are, perhaps, because, well, it makes the idea of the people a bit more real if you're collectivist. You're reifying the idea of the group more, whereas we, as individualists, see it more as making sure that everybody has a fair say because we're all separate individuals, rather than taking the rule of the people literally, because we don't necessarily believe in the people in the way that the ancient Athenians would have. What do you think about that?
Well, that's another huge topic. I mean, there are also whole books and classics written about this. To what extent were the Athenians individualistic? And, there's a school of thought which says they were basically kind of proto-million liberals. And that's the beginning of that tradition. And there's a school of thought which says, no, they were this very old-fashioned, typical kind of pre-modern culture.
So it maps onto that kind of question you were talking about before, the extent to which they were define themselves in terms of kinship.
Yeah. And I think really the answer is as often sort of somewhere in the middle. I mean, they obviously were a pre-modern culture, but the interesting thing about the Greeks, I mean, I tell the students this in the first year, is that you can see that they're actually quite distinctive in some ways from the cultures that are around them.
Yes.
Great empires of the Near East. I mean, there are phases in the Near East where they seem to have city-states as well. So again, I don't want to be too black and white in drawing that picture, but it seems like the Greeks do have a distinctive culture. They have more egalitarian state forms. It's more broken up. They have these small city-states. If you believe some work that's been done recently on the ancient economy, the Greeks inaugurate one of the longest sustained periods of economic growth before the Industrial Revolution,
right,
which in our terms looks pathetic. It's sort of like 0.2 or 3% per year, but just stretched over a long time. And I think it's difficult to argue that things aren't better by the time you get to the High Roman Empire than they were in the
Sure.
Greek Dark Ages, and you can see that in the buildings that they put up and the sizes of the size of the houses that they inhabit. In the skeletal record, people are getting
Healthier
taller and
longer.
they're living longer and things like that. So it seems like there is an economic boom by pre-modern standards, and of course, any economic boom by pre-modern standards looks absolutely pathetic compared to anything
with the
after
Industrial Revolution. Sure.
But still,
Yeah.
it's kind of interesting.
But to set aside, the details of the Athenian case, and take it to a more abstract level, and to go back to that idea of democracy as the rule of the people, you would agree, presumably, that the different cultures have different conceptions of what the people would be, perhaps partly based on how collectivist they are. And so, as a highly individualistic culture, the people for us is a distant idea in some sense. I mean, what do we think of the people as being? Is it just a collection of individuals, or is there? I mean, we can think of nationhood as something unifying, but within that we value individuality and individual freedom.
Yes and no. I mean, I think in some ways we are a highly individualistic culture. I think there's a point to which you can take this sort of skepticism about what the people are too far. Because I remember, for example, after the Brexit referendum, a lot of people were suddenly saying, well, what are the people anyway? Because people, after the referendum...
Well, there's a bit of disingenuity.
Well, I don't want to say that outright.
Disingenuousness, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, you'd say, well, the people voted for this. And they'd say, well, what are the people? And I mean, I guess I'm not literal-minded, simple-minded or something, but it's
the answer to it, technically, in that sense, is just it's a majority. A majority said yes, leave, so that's it.
Well, I think it's more that we have a conception of the people which we use all the time. We often talk about groups doing things, and we often say the All Blacks did this, or New Zealanders are like this, or that maybe isn't a great example, but New Zealand did this, or PricewaterhouseCoopers did this, or Victoria University of Wellington did this, the Classics program did this, whatever it is. And I think everybody knows kind of at the back of their mind that it's not, when you say the Classics program did this, it's not exactly the same as if you say James Kierstead did this. But we're very comfortable talking about these things.
I suppose so. I mean, perhaps, with my libertarian tendencies, I struggle with that concept a bit more than is typical.
No, it's an interesting thing to talk
I've never
about.
felt particular affinity to a country, for example. I understand, I guess if I feel like a New Zealander, it's because of something, for example, a poem by James K. Baxter or the sight of a particular mountain, rather than a sense of, what it is to be a New Zealander or liking the All Blacks or those kind of more typical senses of nationhood that we have.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, now we're getting into sort of sentimental objects of belonging. I mean, that's not meant to be kind of put down. I mean, more emotional aspects of belonging, which some people have more and some people have less. And I think that's fine. That's part of political and psychological diversity. People just feel differently about things. They identify more or less with groups. The Athenians, one thing that pops into my mind is just that if you read Athenian inscriptions, a lot of interesting evidence from them, inscribing their laws and their decrees, things they decided in the assembly, and they had a habit of putting these up in public on display. And and after a while, it becomes formulaic what they put at the beginning, just like an official document nowadays might have some official language at the beginning. And the most common thing they put at the beginning is the people decided, or sometimes, or often, the people in the council decided. So the people in the assembly and the council of 500. But basically, they do seem to have an idea that the people do things. And when you read Greek historians, they talk about the Athenians did this, the Spartans or the Lacedaemonians did this. So they talk about them as groups of people. They don't necessarily say Sparta did this or Athens did this. So there are lots of interesting things to say about that. But I mean, I've read there are people like, I don't know, James Buchanan and William Riker and Kenneth Arrow, who won the Nobel Prize for his work on the group decision making. Of course, there's a whole field, as you know, of social choice theory and public choice theory, and certain people on the libertarian right have been very skeptical of the idea of group agency at all. And really, Kenneth Arrow's Impossibility Theory, I suppose, is a way of saying, well, it's complicated exactly what it's saying or what it says, but basically it's chipping away at the idea that a group of people can make decisions which are coherent in certain logically well-defined ways, right?
Yes. I suppose I'm not skeptical of the group can make decisions. I think it just scares me, the kind of decisions they're likely to make. I guess I have a sense of the mob or something when I think about groups making decisions, and it seems to me often very visceral and very primitive in a way when a group acts, as opposed to when individuals act, which can also be psychopathic and
That's
all
right.
of that. But somehow the individual seems to me to have a greater capacity for clarity and perspicacity and so on.
Well, it depends on the individual, doesn't it?
It does. It depends. I'm not saying individuals always do that, but the possibility for greater clarity seems to be there in the case of the individual than the group. It's not clear to me how a group would make a nuanced decision in the way that an individual might be able to.
But surely, I mean, you might say the opposite is the case, because with a group of people, you have lots of people with different perspectives on an idea.
Which is a valuable thing, and that's how we might, that's that Popperian idea of thrashing out the right answer through discourse, right? But then there's no inevitability that all members of the group will draw the same conclusion, and actually it may be that all that happens is that different members of the group all develop their own individual thinking more, which is great, but it doesn't constitute a coherent conclusion on the part of the group.
Well, this is where I think the decision-making theory and voting theory becomes interesting, because I think, so one objection is often, well, democracy and direct democratic procedures will be incoherent just because you won't be able to make a decision. You can make decisions because voting are decision-making procedures,
right.
and you install one, you simple majority vote, for example, or whatever, and you will have a result at the end. Now, I guess what Kenneth Arrow and people were interested in is, are these votes consistent in various ways? If a group of people is preferring A to B to C, and they have a few other rounds of voting, will they then be asserting actually C is better than A or whatever, right? So that would be inconsistent in a logical way. But yeah, I mean, the mob rule thing is interesting. The mob rule versus sort of individual decision making is interesting, because I guess it's a conversation that we've been having for centuries, maybe even millennia now, about which is better, the more people as a check on the individual, because the individual can become tyrannical. And in fact, giving individuals power seems to make them more tyrannical. So there's a whole power corrupts type thing. And the Greeks were very aware of this too. I mean, even to the point of caricaturing it, they had a lot of tropes about tyrants. And then on the other side, there's this fear of, majority tyranny or the mob or whatever you want to call it. And actually, this is something I said in the Free Speech podcast too, that my thought is evolving on this, because I think in the early 2000s and the 90s, it looked like the mob type stuff. I didn't have any kind of personal awareness of this problem. And I think that now I see it more in academia, and I see it on social media. And I think I see now what Thucydides and other critics of the Athenian democracy saw. And I think, one of the things I think Thucydides and others were concerned with was so-called cascades. Well, that's what the modern social scientists like Cass Sunstein and others call them. Thucydides didn't call them that, but he clearly has a concern for sort of bandwagoning effects in the assembly. He often has depictions of the mass assembly making decisions, like in the decision to launch the expedition to Sicily, which was disastrous for Athens. It seems like, people get an idea in their heads, and then a sort of senior politician, in this case, Nicias, stands up and says, hey guys, we've got to be careful about this. If we want to send an expedition to Sicily, we'll have to send a lot of ships. It's going to be really expensive. And because people are already riled up, they don't say, you know what, he's right, let's just not do it. They think, this is going to be even better. Let's just go, and I think you can see that. That's some kind of emotional cascade, but there are also these informational cascades of the sort where you kind of think, well, let's make a decision about something. Shall we ban tall buildings in Wellington? I don't know. I have no information on this. Michael, you go first. Maybe you have no information about this either. You say, yes, let's ban them. I'm next in line. If you put up your hand, if we have a form of voting where you're able to show your preference, it comes next to me, I think, well, I'm 50-50. I have no information. The only piece of information I have is just this thing that's been very salient because it's just happened and I've seen it, which is Michael. And, even if I don't know anything about you, I think, well, that's one piece of information. I'll do it too. And then the next person in line sees two people. Next person put up their hand.
After that, social conformity kicks in and it's inevitable. Yeah.
And really, I mean, social conformity, what is that? I mean, part of it you can be read as this epistemic process where people are looking for sources of information. Of course, there's more going on as well because there's a shaming effect. People don't feel comfortable speaking out. Yes. But I think the Athenian critics of democracy were interested in these phenomena, and I think I'm starting to take them a bit more seriously. They're not just an aristocratic trope. So, I mean, it doesn't mean I don't think, oh, that means everything I thought about democracy was wrong. We have to throw it out. It's not that. It's more like this is something like we were saying last time. There are things in human nature that we need to take into account. So let's think carefully about institutions and try and get it right. Take my jacket off.
Yes. Well, there's something I'd like to sort of probe a bit about your field of study more generally, which is something I think about a lot in my work, which is the structure of knowledge within. So, for a start, would you see classical studies as a unified discipline, or is it a multidisciplinary thing that obviously it uses some of the tools of archaeology and some of sort of literary analysis and some of perhaps just historical analysis? What is it its own thing, or is it just a confluence of these other disciplines?
No, I think it's extremely interdisciplinary, really. I mean, that's partly why I went into it in England. I mean, partly because England has a way of organizing undergraduate courses that they're very specialized, and I wanted to do a lot of different fields at once, and so classic was a way of doing that. So I could do literature in 2 different languages. I could get some linguistics from studying ancient languages, which are very different to modern languages. I could do history through reading ancient historians and studying, the ancient past through other forms of evidence. Could do a bit of art history, philosophy. I studied philosophy.
Yes.
So all these things are present in classics, and really, I mean, the field is, as with some other fields, but maybe even to a greater extent, it's not particularly well defined, and you'll find that in certain parts of the world, for example, there are no classics. I mean, classics really is an Anglophone thing, and even in the English-speaking world, you'll find at some universities they have ancient historians are in with the historians, and then the classicists are in schools of culture. Like, for example, at Vic, we happen to be in the School of Languages and Cultures, even though some of us are more historians than scholars of literature.
Yes. Yeah.
So that can happen. So there's a lot going on.
And it's a field that's defined really by its interest in particular geographic areas at particular periods of time, isn't it? I mean, especially the Hellenes and the Romans are the big fields of study in the...
That's right. So this is a conversation we're having in the field at the moment. To what extent should we just say we are really Greco-Roman studies? I mean, most classicists now and for a long time have basically focused on the Greeks or the Romans or a combination of both. Now, it's also true that classics has long had a fine tradition of engaging with Near Eastern cultures, and that goes back quite far. And I think, nowadays, a lot of people are saying, we need to do that more, and I think that's right. With a lot of these things, I think that...
So ancient ones like Egypt or...
Yeah, that's right. So we should study ancient Egypt. We should engage more with the Hittite Empire or the ancient Assyrians and things like that. And I think that's absolutely fine. We can do that. I mean, with a lot of these things, I think that at the moment, I think the conversation is very much like, we should have been doing this, and that means we're bad not to have done it because we've been...
somehow chauvinistic
or something like that, or blinkered. And I think that maybe there's a bit of that, but also a lot of these things have pragmatic reasons for them, and
there may even be substantive ones. I mean, I'm, as you know, I have quite a strong lay interest in these areas, and it seems, well, as you've put it to me, that there is something special about what happened in the Hellenic era, that they got away for the first time really from empire building and, building monuments to themselves, to contemplating deeper questions about the world and humanity, whether that was their philosophy, their mathematics, their literature. It was fundamentally a new thing in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think they did a bit of empire building themselves, especially
Sure,
the
sure, that
Romans,
was part of it, but the fact that wasn't all it was.
yeah. I mean, you could say the Egyptians and the Chaldeans and so on and so forth had interesting, and maybe the Pythagorean theory was present in Babylon
Yeah,
before. So again,
yeah.
it's easy. It's easy to be too sort of black and white about these
Perhaps,
things to make
yeah.
too strong distinctions. But I do think, I've said this already in this interview. Like, there's something distinctive about the Greeks and the Romans, and I think it's more the political system and the economic products of that. But there are people like the German ancient historian Egon Flagg who's argued quite strongly, I think, a pretty old-fashioned way of thought, really, which is that or what seems old-fashioned now, which is that the Greek cultural efflorescence, which I don't want to be too black and white. They're not the only people to have ever had a philosophy or anything like that. But nonetheless, it was pretty outstanding. I mean, they seem to have gone places where previous cultures hadn't, and that's interesting. And even the Romans who came after them saw them as superior culturally.
Yes. Yeah.
So Egon Flagg's argued that this is basically a product of competition and diversity in terms of different city-states and open argument, people being free to say what they want, and then getting into competitions of an intellectual sort with each other. And then you could even argue, and some people have, that the kind of mathematics and canons of logic and rigor that the Greeks develop from Aristotle onward, and even before Aristotle, those things are designed to basically smack somebody down in the sort of cage of argument and rhetoric.
Yeah.
So you develop those things precisely because you need to defend yourself. Maybe in other cultures you have a position or whatever, and you don't need to kind of defend your argument in that way to the same degree. So yeah, so I think the Greeks and the Romans are distinctive in some ways, but I mean, I guess the Assyrians are distinctive in some ways too. So I mean, all these things I think are worthy of study.
Yes.
Now, we could just call ourselves ancient Mediterranean studies or something like that, and the great English classical scholar Kenneth Dover, who I think I mentioned before in the last podcast, he says basically classics is just part of the study of the past. That's the best way to justify it. So in some ways, a lot of what we do at a university is a study of the past. I mean, of course, not all the scientific, not every aspect of the scientific fields and stuff like that. But for Dover, what we're doing even when we study ancient literature is really literary history. It's not so much literary criticism, it's looking at how things develop over time in terms of the writing of the past. And ancient history is obviously all about ancient history, but even when we study Greek philosophy, it's really, for him, from his perspective, it's more about the history of philosophy. So you can look at classics really as just part of the study of the past, and that makes it very easy or relatively easy to justify in terms which have more traction nowadays, a bit more traction. I mean, nowadays everything's quite utilitarian, but you can, say, study the Greco-Roman past deserves a place because it's a big part of the human past. Greek was, very influential and common language for many centuries, and was used all the way from Egypt to Afghanistan, and Latin as well, very influential scholarly language well into the Renaissance and early modern period. So you can, etc. You can justify the study of the classical past that way. But then of interest to me is also that there's something else going on in classics, which is when we use the term classics, and this is something that sort of contemporary critics have pointed out, you're basically making a claim to being a bit special. The works that we study are classics. That's the claim, that they're particular in some way, and not just particular, they're extra good. They're especially good.
Or maybe foundational for us.
Yeah, so that's another question. So our classics, and then so some people would say what we should do is say these are the Western classics,
which would be a fair point.
Which I think is fine. Yeah, I wouldn't mind that. Or maybe just assume. You could even say, well, if you're in a Western country and you go to a classics department, just expect that they'll be the Western classics. But
I know for a fact the Chinese have their own classics, for example.
And then you have to say, well, to what extent are we still in Western countries rather than we're in some kind of universalistic culture, right? So different people have different answers to that. But I wouldn't mind at all saying that we're studying the Greco-Roman classics or the Greco-Roman or the Western classics or something like that. But it's interesting because, you have this other way of looking at it, which is these are really good things to read. And when you get to the really good things to read idea, I guess there's an aspect of that which is literary history, but there's also an aspect of that which is I've chosen to read these things because I think they're in some way admirable or interesting, especially interesting. So then you're making a qualitative judgment. And you're always making a qualitative judgment when you're doing a kind of syllabus. Even people who say we need to break open the things that we study, they're still going to end up having a list of certain books rather than others because there's only so many classes in a term, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So I think what we're doing when we're looking at the classics as classics is closer to the idea of education that Matthew Arnold had, another person I mentioned in the last podcast who was a poet and a critic. And he has this phrase about the best that has been said and thought in the world. And that explanation is a bit out of kilter with the modern educational culture, I think. Well, you should tell me. You're the Associate Dean of Education.
Yeah.
But I think there's something in that. And then that actually kind of opens things up to to an understanding that actually there are lots of different things going on in a university and in a university education. So one of these things is I'm a student, I want to know about the human past. I want to know about the Greek part of the human past. I'm going to go study Greek with James. I'm going to do a Greek history class. And another thing is I'm a sort of developing human being, and I want to know all the great things that have been said or thought on some great topics, God and the world and sex and love and death, all these things, right? And so I think that is happening, and it's interesting because I think there's a bit of a misfit, or not a misfit, but a difference between the kind of scholarly work that gets done nowadays and the kind of thing that goes on in the classroom. So, for example, like a few years ago, my colleague and I did this course where I read Lucretius with them in one half of the term, and he read Augustine, his Confessions. And Lucretius is this great work of not outright atheism, but skepticism about religion.
Right.
rather robust skepticism about religion. Everything's explained by terms of atoms and the void. It's ancient Epicureanism, basically.
Yep.
And but anyway, the point of that is just that when I'm in the classroom talking about Lucretius' views of death with the students, it's not really a scientific or a historical thing. It's a bit more towards what you might call spiritual, except that it's, especially in the Lucretius case, it's not necessarily religious, but it's a kind of secular form of inquiry and even enjoyment. So it's complicated. I mean, I like the Matthew Arnold phrase, "the best that's been said and thought in the world," because it seems like there are lots of things that you might think are really interesting to hear about that have been said, but not necessarily for logical reasons. They're not just these propositions that are out there for falsification. You might want to read a speech in Thucydides just because you think it's extraordinarily ornate or beautiful.
So this is a purely aesthetic sense of it.
Yeah, and I think so. Then that kind of explanation, I think, makes it a bit harder for certain subjects to justify themselves in the modern academy because we tend to have this very utilitarian view of things.
Yeah.
But I think it is, to be honest, like partly what's going on in these fields, and I would kind of defend that aspect of it too. I think it's going on.
So it spans the aesthetic and the epistemic, is what we might say about.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
It has aspects of both, and I'm the last person in the world to want to sort of rule out the aesthetic, the validity of the aesthetic aspects. I think they're absolutely vital, but I am interested in the epistemic one. So, and that's what I tend to focus on in my work and thinking on curriculum. And so if we think about, for example, the education of science, the education of mathematics, or the education of history in our schools, I think one of the things that's quite lacking, not just now, but always perhaps has been, or at least as far as I'm aware in Western education systems, is a sense of how these things that we call subjects in schools, maths and history and science and so on, where they came from as systems of organising thought and organising ideas and organising truth claims. And I guess I have a fairly good sense of how that works in mathematics, and I have a fairly good sense of how it works in science. I have a less good sense of how it works in history, and I'm interested to ask you about that. So, do you, like a scientist might have something you may not call it a hypothesis, but it might be an idea that you want to test, and then you find some evidence to weigh it against, perhaps with a Popperian idea of falsification as a means of testing it, or is it quite different than that?
Sure, I think that happens all the time. I mean, I think like the critics of Popper, one of the points I think is quite well taken on their part is just that even a falsification is something that happens a lot, and maybe even something that you want to sort of think about getting closer to, and definitely when it comes to certain questions, to make your hypotheses more falsifiable and so on. It's not the only thing that's going on. So even science does stuff which can't be seen just as pure falsification.
Of course,
right?
that's
and I
true.
think this is even more.
I actually see falsification more as a value than anything else.
Right.
A lot of the time, it's a good ideal to hold, and because it keeps us intellectually honest, and it tries, if we adhere to it, then we are more likely to avoid a lot of common cognitive foibles that will otherwise be subject to wanting to prove ourselves correct and aggrandize our ideas and so on.
Yeah, no, but I mean, the pure falsification thing, I think it happens all the time in ancient history, just because, you can say there are various types of claims you can make that then you dig something out of the ground that shows that it's false. That you thought that this thing happened in this year, and then you dig out an inscription and it said. And it's very easy to date because maybe it has the name of a politician on it, which is the way the holders of a certain office on it, which is the way you date inscriptions in Athens, and it just proves that actually that this is false. And there are examples of this in Athenian epigraphy, the technical study of inscriptions, where people say, after this date, people no longer write letters this way. And then they thought that for decades, and then they found an inscription. They managed to find out when it was from, and actually falsified certain things that people have been saying.
Methodologically, probably necessarily that's a lot more ad hoc than a science experiment would be, where you actually set up the conditions whereby you set out to falsify your hypothesis by having a treatment condition and a control condition, and then only if the measured outcome in the treatment condition is statistically different enough to the one in the control condition, are we going to reject the null hypothesis and accept that the theory may have some validity or could gain some validity from that testing of it. Whereas in history, the evidence is by its nature a lot more sketchy, a lot more subject to just what you happen to find, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, people talk about natural experiments in history. I mean, Jared Diamond talks about that, and various other people. And I think it's an especially interesting idea in the Greek context because it's so fragmented. You have all these different city-states using slightly different institutions. But yeah, there's certain ways in which natural experiments can never be like properly controlled experiments. So I guess what you want to do is just assemble the widest array of cases possible.
Yes.
And this is, I think, the value of comparative history, comparative institutional studies and things like that. If you want to look at democracy, take the widest possible set of different types of democratic institutions, see how they play out. And of course, as you say, there are various controls you won't be able to apply, but
that's just the nature of the beast.
That's the nature of the beast, exactly. But I think archaeology. Some people have argued that archaeology should be seen as a certain type of science and social science. I mean, not just in the sense that you can apply scientific methods, because that's kind of a superficial point, but just in the sense that you're trying to figure out how these people lived and what they were up to, and maybe even what they thought about. Sometimes you do have texts. A lot of the time, you don't really. You don't have a lot of literary texts or historical texts, so you're not quite sure what they were up to. And the process of, writing about what they were up to and what they thought and what they ate and everything, I think that can be seen pretty straightforwardly as a scientific process where you say, yes, we think they ate cranberries, and you find, dumb example, we think they ate cattle, and then you find cattle bones. And that doesn't prove it, but you can say, we think that they ate cattle, you find no cattle bones. That doesn't disprove it either. So it's complicated, but you can see that there's some kind of a hypothetical and scientific thinking going on.
And to be fair, of course, in science, it is far from always experimental.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
evolutionary biology, for example, has to rely on the fossil record and so on, in the same way that you might have to rely on the archaeological record, which is...
Exactly. I mean, the fossil record, that's a perfect example, because that's where sort of archaeology and science kind of dovetails, because this was a big thing for Darwin, wasn't it? That there was some analogy where he says the fossil, does he say this, or one of his predecessors? But, the fossil record is like a book where most of the pages have been torn out or are missing, right? So it's very patchy. And this is the story of any ancient historian's life, basically, that you're trying to look at a society, and compared to the kind of evidence you'd have available for a modern society, it's very difficult. We have very little evidence. So like I can't go to an archive where I read all the newspapers that were published in ancient Athens, like the way you might be able to do if you're studying 1920s Germany or something. Can't look at photographs, but I can look at some literary texts, and I can look at inscriptions that have been put up. I can look at the archaeological evidence, and that's kind of the fun of it in a sense. But it's also the difficulty.
And it lends itself. I'm just sort of thinking as you're saying this to a. It's not exactly a cognitive foible, because we need to do it, but we're very good at filling in gaps with stories about things. So I mean, and we do it on the most basic sensory level. So when you think you're looking around this room, actually you're really not. You're focusing on very small elements of it at any given moment, and the rest is filled in either by what you have recently focused on, or actually just neural mechanisms that literally fill in a holistic experience where actually it's a very patchy one. And you can see this in change blindness experiments, where you can change something quite significant about a scene, and unless people were specifically focused on that part of the scene, they won't notice the change. So I guess where that goes in terms of something like the archaeological record is that you find a few bits of evidence, and then you build a story about it, because that's what human beings like to do. And so is there a mechanism to guard against that kind of making up of, the gaps, but the filling in of the gaps between fragments of evidence?
Yes, you know what it's called? It's called academic freedom and viewpoint diversity.
Right. So somebody else coming along and saying, actually, you've made that up.
It sounds kind of like a pat answer, but I mean, I think it's absolutely true, and that's why it's so vital, right? Because, do you know that Stephen Jay Gould book, Wonderful Life? Jess Shale and stuff. Okay, so that's an example where, it's an even better example, because he tells a story about how people misinterpreted it in the past because they came at the evidence with preconceptions, and he says this is now the truth. And then, of course, people after him published the stuff saying he was doing the same thing, right? Which we all do. But the idea is that you get closer to the truth because people balance each other's biases out, and they can see better than you can yourself where you're filling in the gaps in a particular way. And probably I think I do have like a Whiggish bias, right? That I'm more inclined to see democracy as leading to prosperity and freedom and things like that. I mean, I think I have good reasons, but of course everybody thinks they have good reasons for their viewpoints. So that's why it's important to have people argue about these things. And I think that's happened in ancient history a lot too. And people just...
And of course, it happens in science, even with the most rigorous experiments, and the interpretation of that kind of evidence is still subject to refinement through that kind of argumentation. But I am interested in the methods, the more formal methods of the historical disciplines.
We should probably wrap up at some point.
Oh yeah, what have we got?
An hour and 10.
Okay, well maybe we'll finish with this question. What do you actually do when you take it on to answer or to address a particular question in your discipline?
Well, that's an interesting question, because again, my discipline, it's super interesting. One of the reasons I like it is because there's so many different things going on.
So give me an example of something that you've looked into and how you went about it.
Oh, well, okay. I mean, there's so many different things. Well, let me just say, because I like the fact that my field is sort of multidisciplinary and there's lots of things going on in it. And so I've written stuff which is sort of analytic philosophy, a tiny amount of that. I've written stuff which could just be called literary criticism, like a reading of a Greek play, things like that. And mainly I do ancient historical stuff, but a lot of my ancient historical stuff is in the kind of field that used to be more controversial and now is becoming more accepted, which is looking at what we might learn from the past and the present. So this democracy, ancient democracy, modern democracy interface, as it were. But okay, I'll answer your question. Let's just take an example of there's a text written either by Aristotle or by one of his students. It's known as the Constitution of the Athenians. There are several texts called that, but this is the one written in the school of Aristotle, in the Lyceum in the late 4th century BC. And this is very obscure, but this is the kind of gains you make in scholarship, right? If they're gains at all. Incremental advances, which is, I was reading a commentary on this text, and the text clearly says X, and the commentator, very prestigious, well-known scholar, said, I don't think this is true. And so what I did in my article is just to look through the reasons that he gave for not thinking this is true and sort of shooting them down and saying, no, I think the text is what the text said. There's no reason not to believe that what the text says is true. So what was I doing there? I mean, one of the things, I suppose, is that he was relying on a sentence from Aristophanes. And I thought he was taking it a bit too seriously. So that's one of the things you can do, is sort of question, I guess, the kinds of claims that certain pieces of evidence are making. Is Aristophanes just making a propositional statement, or is it better seen as just kind of a crazy joke? Even if it's a crazy joke, must have been referring to something the Athenians would have known about, right? So then you have to look into that, what was really going on. And so thanks to a friend, actually, I deduced some evidence of what I thought was really going on, which was different to what the other scholar thought was really going on. So there's a lot of different things that go into even like a particular case of a particular academic article.
So could you say it's a bit like detective work? You could say science is, but I actually don't think it is, because you set up the conditions, ideally, not always, but in the experimental situation, you set up the conditions to provide the evidence. Whereas what you're doing is you notice something that's interesting. They seem to be taking that Aristophanes statement a bit seriously.
Yeah.
What's behind that? So how could I find out? Well, I could look here. So you go and look, and then you follow the trail. Is that the kind of process?
Yes, I guess in a lot of cases it does feel like detective work.
Yeah.
Especially because I think in ancient history, especially, it's false to say that there's no new stuff that comes to light, because I just posted something on Twitter the other day that in the Athenian Agora, they recently have uncovered a text, a new inscription, so a new piece of information, and this happens all the time in ancient history. People dig up new stuff, new inscriptions, new archaeological evidence. However, it's obviously the case that we have less new information coming to light than in other fields. So a lot of the game in ancient history is, given what we all know, what do we say about it? And that's where I think, actually, in the humanities, I think in the sciences, the argument for viewpoint diversity is very strong, because we, as the replicability crisis in social sciences and psychology especially has shown, we underestimate the extent to which, even in the sciences, bias plays a role. But in the humanities, it plays an enormous role, because it's so obvious the ways in which political
less constrained by evidence.
I think it's still constrained by evidence. It's just that there's a lot of wiggle room. There's a lot of ways in which you can rearrange the pieces to support
That's what I meant. The constraints are looser in that sense.
I guess that's true. Yeah. The constraints are looser. Yeah. But that makes it interesting. And I think you have to be on your guard that if you're having too much fun just arranging the pieces in the way that looks pretty to you. But to some extent, that's also like a source of great interest and joy in it. And it's good to have a field. The ideal is to have a field in which lots of interesting people with different points of view are rearranging those pieces in different ways.
And elegance is important. I used to play a lot of chess. I played it competitively, and it was really true that I would prefer to lose a close run and beautiful game than to sort of walk over a much weaker player in a sort of ugly fashion. So
yes, it's interesting what you mean by that. But
certainly in mathematics, elegance is huge. It's an elegant proof is highly prized. It's no more true or no more valid than a kind of clunky and ugly one. But in the end, aesthetics is important.
Yeah, that's when you get the sort of brilliancy prizes in chess for, you may not have come top in the tournament, but you did this especially cool looking move or whatever. But I think that all these things are part of sort of what makes humans tick and what make the world interesting. And I guess just to close on this point again about the modern university, when I was studying, I studied briefly political science and institutional theory. And there was a view, we studied various theories about what makes institutions work. And there are various very elegant theories, like it's all driven by self-interest or it's all driven by social pressures or whatever. And then there was this one called the garbage bag theory or the garbage can theory. And that, March and Olson, I think, are the names associated with that. And that was just basically like institutions are places where all this stuff just happens and we don't know why.
That's it.
and I thought at the time, everyone especially me, because I have this kind of same hankering, the hankerings that you do towards some harmony and elegance and things. I just thought this is the worst theory. It's not. I don't even know if it's even a theory.
It's not, because stuff happens.
But in a way, but the more I think about the modern university and what it is, and Oxford was like this in some ways. Vic is like that in different ways, because like at Oxford you had like Anglican priests who still also had roles in the university. They weren't dominant or that numerous even, but it just kind of like that thing happened in the past, like that there was an Anglican institution, so they had these priests, and then these people are still around doing like theological work, and then there were people doing like particle physics, and any good university will have a mix of people doing these different things. And I do think that it makes a lot of sense for people to ask questions about where all the tax money is going and where the private donations are going, but there also has to be a little bit of room that the university is doing different things, and a lot of these, not all of these things, are things that you can sort of show to be valuable in the same way along the same metric.
I think that's right. That's where I'd part company with some of my libertarian cohort. I think that markets are bad at cultural stuff in general because they can't necessarily deliver the economic value that an investor might expect, but the cultural value is something else, and it is a complex ethical question as to the extent that taxpayers who derive no direct benefit from the university ought to pay for it. But that to me is answered if the university was doing its job truly and rigorously of the critic and conscience of society, because then it is repaying that in a different way than just economically.
Yeah, no, I think that it's perfectly fair. Again, maybe I part ways with David Seymour or whoever in this, but I think it's perfectly fair to, if people have certain conceptions of what things are good and they vote for parties who are going to put that into play, and one of the things they think is good is to have a place where all these things can happen, which is reasonably, well funded, not lavishly, but all these different forms of inquiry can take place, then that's absolutely fine. And I should go and mark papers, but I'll end. Yes. How about I end with an apothegm or a gnome?
Go ahead.
So this is something we'll discuss next time. But the market. Some people make an analogy between markets and democracy. The only thing that I dislike about markets, the only undemocratic thing about markets, because they have a lot of choice elements in them, is that unlike with the vote, some people have more money and some people have less.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
Okay.
And on that note, we will conclude, so as not to go full Joe Rogan 3 hours.
Yeah,
or something.
that's right.
Yeah. Thank you, James, and that concludes the second Free Kiwis podcast.
And then we said last time we need to get some people on it who aren't us. So.
Yeah, well, and I've got a few ideas.
We've got some people lined up. Yeah. So that's good. Okay.
Brilliant.